Hello, this is Ed Runkle, pastor of Tapestry Church, and we welcome you wherever you are in life's journey to join us here for our messages, or join us at 22 Crady Avenue in Millersville, Pennsylvania on Sunday mornings at 10:30. We're a simple church seeking to humbly follow Jesus as best we can, and all are welcome. Welcome to Tapestry Church, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I don't know if maybe you saw, this was in the news recently, I saw an interesting statistic that India has the highest open defecation rate in the world. Seriously, as the British Telegraph reports, with 620 million people creating 65 million kilograms of open waste each day, only half of its population use a toilet. And in answer to that challenge, UNICEF has launched a new campaign called Let's Take the Poo to the Loo. And more formally, it's known as the Poo to the Loo initiative. Now, this initiative is directed primarily at children, and so it features a short educational video in which Mr. Pooh, the unlikely star of the Poo to the Loo initiative, chases a man down the street until the townspeople construct a giant lavatory to flush public defecation away. Now, here's why I tell you this. It sometimes seems as though there's at least a segment of the population in the United States these days that would be happy to have organized religion flushed away. But have you ever wondered or thought about what it might be like to live in a world with no organized religion? Or more specifically, can you imagine a world without Christianity? Can you imagine a post-Christian world? What would that look like? Well, that's what we're going to be thinking about over the next few weeks. And in particular, today, we're going to think about that in terms of this concept of innate human equality and dignity. And where does that idea come from? Well, to think about that, we're going to look at a text from the New Testament book of Acts. And this is from chapter 10. And in this chapter, there's a man named Cornelius who's a Roman centurion who's received a vision from God. And at the same time, Peter, an apostle and a disciple of Christ, is receiving a vision as well. And the two of these guys are going to get together. And I'm going to start in verse 9 and speak specifically about Peter's vision. The next day, as they were on their journey, this is Cornelius, and he has sent men to find Peter. That is what his vision was about, finding Peter. So these men are on the way. The next day, as they were on their journey, approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. And in it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. And so Peter responds to this vision. He goes with Cornelius' men back to Cornelius' home, and hears Cornelius' story and invites Cornelius to accept Christ and to be baptized. And picking up at verse 34, "So Peter opened his mouth and said, 'Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him.'" Well, there's a slight problem here for Peter, because much of what Peter sees in this vision is not on the authorized Jewish menu. In fact, Peter interrupts this voice in his vision and confidently affirms, I've never eaten anything impure or unclean. As some of you know, Peter was known for his "I never" statement, some of which he did in fact end up eating. Maybe you have at one time or another uttered an "I'll never" statement, only to end up eating your words. Well, Peter, he was about to discover that God was not going to simply change his lunch options, but God was going to teach him something about people. People God created, people for whom Christ died. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. And I suppose, Peter was a little like I am, so hard-headed that God had to tell him 3 times. Now, in Peter's defense, a Roman soldier such as Cornelius, well, it would have been assumed that, he would have been an oppressor of Jews and an outright enemy of Christians. And as you may know, he would have been someone with the ability to have Peter put to death. Remember, Peter watched Jesus get executed by the Romans. But the statement being made here is clear. The gospel is for everyone. And it isn't for Peter, it isn't for you or for me to decide who Jesus did or didn't die for. And to think about this message on a personal level, it means that there is absolutely nothing inherent in you, in who you are, that disqualifies you from receiving God's grace and finding forgiveness for your sins in Jesus. No one created by God was created unclean. Now, that doesn't mean we aren't sinners, but it does mean that everyone is approachable with the gospel, that there isn't anyone who would be left out from hearing it because of who they are. The New Testament writer Christ in the Lord of glory. This is the second of only 2 times that James mentions Jesus. The word for partiality that he uses there combines 2 Greek words, one meaning to accept and the other meaning to judge according to one's face. Showing partiality then has to do with giving someone preferential treatment based upon their status within society. The idea is taking people at face value. You look at them and you immediately begin to make judgments. She's a fake. He's a loser. They're no fun. We tend to make judgments based on appearance, socially, culturally, and even spiritually. Here's what I'm getting at. We're naturally drawn toward those that are either similar to us or to those we believe might do us some good. And even in Christian circles, there are those who seem to get more excited as if the cause will strengthen when a celebrity becomes a Christian rather than, say, when a poor widow becomes a Christian. There are those who, when a celebrity, goes public with their faith, get more excited about that than when you or I go public with our faith. It's interesting. I heard an interesting story that when Oxford and Cambridge universities in England decided to admit commoners as students in the 1600s, this unprecedented flood of new students had a tremendous impact on British society in those days. And so each of these students was listed on the school record by name and title. And the commoners' names were listed with the Latin inscription sine nobilitate, meaning without nobility. The abbreviation was S-Nob. Anybody ever hear that story? It's an interesting story. I thought it was so clever. I recently read that it probably is not the origin of the word snob, but I thought about how it speaks of snobbery and how that is a word that persists in our day. Anybody here ever use that word? Anybody ever been called a snob? It, by definition, is one who obviously imitates, fawningly admires, or vulgarly seeks association with those in a superior position, or one who looks down on those in an inferior position, one whose attitude is offensively superior. Well, as a matter of historical record, the Greco-Roman world's religious views, while they were open and seemingly tolerant, while everyone had his or her own God, the practices of the culture were actually quite brutal. Everything was actually the exact opposite. The ancient world was rather snobbish in that it celebrated the strong and the heroic and not the vulnerable and the weak. The Greco-Roman world was highly stratified and layered, especially economically, with a huge difference between the rich and the poor. In fact, a guy named René Girard, a French philosopher who taught at Stanford University and a brilliant anthropologist, became fascinated with the question, why in modern times does the marginalized person have a kind of moral authority? Well, Girard traced this social phenomenon all the way back to the life of Jesus. He discovered that with his birth and death, Jesus introduced a new plot in human history. This idea that the victim mattered, that people who were oppressed mattered. In other words, while Christians insisted that there was only one true God, the crucified and resurrected Jesus Christ, in their lives and in their practices, they were remarkably open, welcoming to those that the culture marginalized. Again, it's a matter of historical fact that the early Christians mixed people from different races and classes in ways that seemed scandalous to those around them. Whereas the Greco-Roman world tended to despise the poor, Christians gave generously, not only to their own poor, but to those of other faiths. And whereas in the broader society, women had a low status and were subjected to high levels of female infanticide and things like forced marriages and a lack of equality, it was another story in the Christian community. In fact, in the news not too long ago, there was a story about a pregnant Pakistani woman who was killed by her father, who along with his sons and about a dozen other male relatives used bricks and clubs to beat her to death because she married for love rather than participate in an arranged marriage. And while the public nature of that stoning was unusual, such honor killings are not in certain segments of Pakistani culture. Similarly, there was a story not long ago about a Sudanese woman recently sentenced to death for refusing to renounce Christianity. Her marriage to a Christian was not valid under Islamic law. Well, Christianity afforded women much greater security and equality than had ever previously existed in the ancient classical world, and evidently in parts of our world in our day. But why? Why would such a seemingly exclusive belief system, one God, Jesus Christ, lead to a behavior that was so open to others? Well, maybe it had something to do with Jesus sharing water with a Samaritan divorcee, or with Jesus having a party with a tax collector. I mean, who would have thought such actions would have such far-reaching significance? Who would have thought that a Judean carpenter who never wrote a word and never traveled extensively would so radically alter the world? I mean, Jesus' life would deconstruct an economy 1,500 years later that was built on slave trading. And after 2,000 years, it was, Jesus and his movement would have an impact on the civil rights movement and would have an impact on things like sex trade and human trafficking in our day. Because see, it was Jesus who awakened us to the reality that the worst lie anybody can believe is that some lives matter more than others. And he does it by standing with all the wrong people, or more to the point, by partying with all the wrong people. In fact, a good rule of thumb in terms of Jesus' kind of parties, if you find yourself at a party with all the wrong people, you're probably at the right party. Again, this was in the news not too long ago. There was a story outlining how NFL cheerleaders are paid less than the minimum wage, and kind of disrespected and treated quite poorly. And the article raised the question, well, why would they put up with that kind of behavior? And it concludes that in many ways the appeal is an extension of what we were all taught in high school, that it's important to be, to be seen and to be noticed and to be picked, to be chosen. And even more than that, there's something about the human condition that we want to be a part of something. We want in some small way to matter. So despite the obvious inequity of working for next to nothing for billionaire owners and celebrity players paid millions on behalf of advertisers earning even more, despite those conditions and insults, women keep trying out to be picked by the team. There's a kind of fascinating lesson about human nature in all of that. That people aren't always driven by a rational analysis of work as an exchange for cash, but we want to be seen and we seek to belong. And it's a shame when an organization takes advantage of that and treats people unfairly. Christianity, on the other hand, says everyone matters and offers anyone and everyone, even an enemy, a Gentile, a Roman centurion and his family, the chance to belong, for heaven's sake. Now, if we're going to follow Jesus in showing this kind of impartiality, in extending this kind of welcome, in loving in such an impartial way, that will require that we kind of loosen our grip on our sense of security and our sense of personal comfort, which is no small thing. I mean, I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of my life as a Christian trying to spiritually finagle my way out of life's discomforts. Thinking that if I claimed the right verses and prayed the right prayers and did the right things, then I could expect an abundant life. A life filled with blessings, marked by a scarcity of difficulties. I wanted God to be, sugar daddy more than Abba Father. I wasn't thinking about pursuing Him, but about escaping my discomfort. I wanted relief and ease. And a lot more, I wanted that a lot more than I wanted a changed heart. And maybe you can relate. I'm probably not the only one. But think about Peter here. How comfortable do you think it would have been for Peter to practice impartiality with Cornelius? What he sensed from God in his vision would have gone against everything he knew to be true. It was unlawful for a Jew to visit with or associate with someone from another nation. When Peter was asked to do what Peter was asked to do would have been pretty much unthinkable, would have been beyond his understanding. But gospel-centered people are those who, are willing to step out of their, what they understand in their comfort zones, are willing to kind of give up their place for others and not, guard their comfort. It's kind of an un-American notion. It's kind of like laying down one's rights. And again, just being honest, I have a hard time with that. Something in me rises up when I feel as if I've been wrong. For instance, if you cut me off out on Route 30, I want to at least speed up to you and give you a look to let you know that I'm not happy about it. I think, for me, like with Peter, the biggest struggle is this kind of, the biggest struggle in showing impartiality is kind of our narcissistic and self-centered culture. Everyone wants success. But because Jesus won for us, it's like we're free to lose. Think about it like this. When you think about the civil rights movement in the United States, what brought America to its knees in that movement? It wasn't an army of people rioting in the streets and cursing and screaming at their abusers. but it was, a kid being attacked by a German shepherd, in the streets of 1963 Birmingham and refusing to retaliate. It was the sight of what someone described as strange fruit, that is, lynched black bodies, swinging from southern trees. It was the sight of that thunderous rush of water from fire hydrants turned on peaceful marchers that would topple Jim Crow. Do you see what I'm saying? When we ease up our grip on what is rightfully ours, we don't lose ground. We actually gain ground. And that's the gospel. When Peter eases up his grip on his limited understanding of God's plan for Christianity, he doesn't lose ground. The faith doesn't, the early church doesn't lose ground, but gains momentum. If we're going to show impartiality as Jesus did, we're going to have to loosen our grip on our sense of comfort and security. But we're also going to have to be able to recognize the difference between discernment and judgment. We may discern a person or a group to be wrong, but when that discernment causes us to value another person or group less, then we've kind of crossed the line into judgment and condemnation and exclusion. And, obviously there are people and groups that we may disagree with, theologically, socially, politically. But we don't want to cross that line from discernment to judgment, where we quickly devalue and write off people as those people, as less valuable. We exclude them from the status that we feel privileged alone to occupy. When we see other people as wrong, that is not just wrong in what they believe, but in wrong, in the core of their identity. It's easy to convince ourselves that we don't have to love them, we don't have to serve them, we don't have to respect them. This exclusion and condemnation of others then, is what fuels so much of what's broken in our world today. I think about how in some circles Christians seem more concerned with making sure, gay people know that homosexuality is sinful than they are at making sure gay people know that God loves them. Even if they speak both messages, it's like the former is the more important one. And if they're going to err, they're going to err on the side of making sure gay people know homosexuality is sinful. And even in cases where people have been victimized in various ways, it often feels to me as that some Christians can only lament what happened if they find a way to reassert their sexual ethics. What happened is wrong, but we still think homosexuality is sinful, just to be clear. Maybe that's the reason why so many people are disenfranchised from the church, leave the church. It's because there's this cognitive dissonance of believing there's something fundamentally, unchangingly unlovable about them. Yet, that's not what Scripture teaches. In some of the verses between what I read earlier, Peter took time to listen to Cornelius. He not only went to Cornelius' home, he which would have taken considerable faith, but he listened. And so that would have been new. That never happened. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, said a long time ago, all those who are not Greek are born slaves by nature. And that's just the way the world thinks. There's our side, and then there are those guys. And, but then there was this community, the early church, who remembered they followed a man who on the night before he died got a basin of water and a towel and washed the feet of those under him like he was their slave. And he said, now what I've done for you, you do. And they remembered this, and they said to slaves, and this is a matter of history, there had never been a community like this. They said to slaves, you're welcome here. You come here. We'll honor you. We'll love you. Can you imagine a world in which that legacy doesn't exist? We make snap judgments every day. And many are innocuous, dealing with the daily routines of life. But when we prejudge another person, assume we know their story, choosing not to listen to their verbal and nonverbal communication, we make the saddest mistake of all. So easy to view people as those guys, as a statistic, and not as individuals for whom Christ died. I mean, think about it like this. The next time you're signing your name at PennDOT or some government office, when you notice the black pen in your hand, it, after all, is exactly like, dozens of black pens you've used in the post office or other buildings, federal buildings throughout your life. You certainly won't think there's much of a story behind the unobtrusive implement that you're, is likely chained to some desk that you're waiting to stand at. But like everything else, those pens have a story. And for over 40 years, those silk Skillcraft pens have been assembled by blind factory workers in Wisconsin and North Carolina. They've met rigorous government specifications to write continuously for a mile and within temperature swings from 40 below zero to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The standard length of the pen, has helped lost Navy pilots navigate by map. Stories say that the pen can be used as a 2-inch bomb fuser for emergency tracheotomies. It can write upside down. It costs less than 60 cents. The pen has a rich, fascinating history woven together with war and peace and postage and bureaucrats and spies and work and play, and you never know it to look at it. Much like many of the people you and I encounter from day to day, every single person has a story, a rich, fascinating history that few of us ever think to ask about. And if we did, we'd be floored, astounded. We'd see each other differently and with more respect. Just like you'll see that pen differently the next time you pick it up. I'm Pastor Ed from Tapestry Church, and we meet at 22 Crady Avenue in Millersville, Pennsylvania, and I invite you to join us on Sundays at 10:30. Thank you.